Loud.
Got it. You got it.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Matthew Weinstein. I'm the head of the Utah chapter of J Street, and delighted to welcome you to this late summer meeting. We've had the really great fortune that we've had a whole bunch of Utahns who have been visiting Israel this year and Palestine, and in a very in-depth way, and with some terrific information to share. And so the way that we've set up this meeting is that we're going to hear from all of them. And if you're not one of the presenters, but you've spent some time in Israel this year, we'd love to hear from you as well. In the course of the meeting, we'll have time for sharing a little later. And I'm also going to share what J Street is up to nationally, and we'll hear about some upcoming opportunities to plug in, both locally and nationally. So we're going to get started. There was a tour of Israel and Palestine, mostly Palestine, that was organized by a group, a nonprofit, in which a couple of staff from U.S. Senator Mike Lee's office participated, and they invited some of the local Utahns that they know have been active and concerned on the Israel-Palestine issue. And so I'm really delighted that we're joined by Carrie and Barbara and Heidi, who were on that trip and are going to share, take the next 20 minutes or so to share what their experiences were. So Carrie, let me turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you so much, Matthew. And thank you, all of you, for being here this evening and sharing this time together. So Barbara and Heidi and I went on this 10-day delegation tour of Israel and Palestine. It was put on by Rebuilding Alliance, which was founded by Donna Berinsky. She's an MIT engineer. And they do a lot of, like Matthew mentioned, it was with staff from Mike Lee's office and also staff representative from Cory Booker's office from New Jersey. So I'm going to be going back and forth here between some pictures so you can have some images to see also. So this was our group. And this is Donna, who is the founder of Rebuilding Alliance. They mostly focus on trying to prevent demolitions for Palestinian homes. So a lot of the tour was focused on visiting places that where homes were under demolition orders. So this was what we did. These were the places we saw and the offices we visited. I'll come back to this slide in a second. But the villages that we met with Palestinians where their homes were under demolition orders included Susia, Masafer Yatta. You got to forgive me. I don't speak either Arabic or Hebrew, so I'm sure I'm slaughtering all these names. But then in this village, the Al-Walaja village, the home there was demolished the day before, and we met the woman whose home it was, and she was quite distraught, and got to hear her story. Right outside of old city of Jerusalem in Silwan, this family's home is getting encroached upon by at work that's being done there. And Al-Aqaba, another village that was also facing demolition orders, or has been facing them. And then we met with this Bedouin village, Khan al-Amer, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. This is the school. They're under constant threat of demolition that's been going on for a very long time. And we also met with settlers in the settlement Kfar Adumim and heard about their experiences living in a settlement. So we had an Israeli and a Palestinian guide. We also visited these 5 government offices and met with 12 representatives from 12 different nonprofit or advocacy groups. So there's so much that we learned. Every day was just really, really dense. So we just wanted to share 3 short stories today. One from Heidi's going to kick us off with this story from the Military Court Watch. These are the two founders that we met with there. I'm going to stop my screen sharing so she can share about that. And then Barbara's going to share a story from our Palestinian guide, and I'm going to share a story from our Israeli guide, and then we'll share one picture at the end. So Heidi.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here today. Thank you for welcoming me here. Carrie, I appreciate you putting together that PowerPoint presentation. It certainly brings back so many memories. I am going to talk a little bit about what is going on among juvenile Palestinians and the raids that happen on their house. So typically what happens is that there is a systemic organized movement of Israeli soldiers that moves into a town, and they identify a couple of homes to raid in the middle of the night. Now, there's two ways for Israelis to break into a home. The first way is to blow the door down. So you can imagine in the middle of the night how shocking it would be to hear an explosion at your door. The second way to enter the home is to use some type of magnets that disconnects the door from the hinges. And so the door is just often moved to the side, and then the Israeli soldiers come in to the home of the Palestinian family. The soldiers will then move into the bedroom, usually of parents and of children, and they're standing there heavily armed. So mothers wake up to seeing their beds surrounded by Israeli soldiers. Children wake up to see heavily armed Israeli soldiers surrounding them. The reason I bring up the entryway is actually for a reason, because at least if your door is blown down, you have a little bit of an indication that something is happening. But when it's done without any sound at all, you're just waking up being surrounded by gunmen in a really vulnerable position in bed. So typically at that point, the Israelis will separate the parents from the children. There's a lot of chaos. The Israeli soldiers damage property within the home. There's a lot of yelling. There's a lot of foul language. And then what they do is they use like the plastic ties to tie the children's hands together. Now, this is interesting because it doesn't allow for a lot of circulation. So it's actually more painful to use the plastic ties than it is to be cuffed in a traditional way. They bring the children outside of their homes. And so the parents look out on the street to see their children who have now been separated by them. And now the children are surrounded by the members of the Israeli military. And then they're marched to a vehicle, and then they are carried away. The youngest child that can be taken and then prosecuted is 12 years old. Most bail is denied among children. 86% of children are denied bail, and they must remain in detention until the conclusion of the legal process. And this can take many months. And many times the charges are trumped up. Usually it's for throwing rocks at an Israeli soldier, but there's maybe no proof of that. And so these kids are just being held. Oftentimes they can be held in isolation, which violates international law. According to The Hague, number 67, all disciplinary measures constituting cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment shall be strictly prohibited, including corporal punishment, placement in a dark cell, closed or solitary confinement. Any other punishment that may compromise the physical or the mental health of the juvenile concerned. So in this circumstance, Certainly when the children are being held in solitary confinement for trumped up charges or for throwing rocks at Israelis, that is against international law. And so they stay in the detention centers. Usually they do not know their attorneys. They will meet their attorneys the day of their trial or their procedure, their legal. Yes, what am I looking for?
Their hearing,
So,
yeah.
Yeah, they don't meet their attorney until that happens, and these attorneys have hundreds of cases. The conviction rate here is 99.74%. And just for perspective, that is right underneath Putin's Russia, but it's above Iran and North Korea. So it is second worst in the world as far as the conviction rate. The judges who preside over these cases are Israeli as well. So the judges are not Palestinian. I think that is something that's really interesting. In the Palestinian courts, the judges are always Israeli. In the Israeli courts, the judges are Israeli. And so that is what is going on there. Carrie, what did I miss?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. So we met with these people. The Military Court Watch is a nonprofit organization that is a group of lawyers and professionals, and they monitor the treatment of children in military detention. And they advocate that these children be treated fairly and under international law. So it was really interesting. We went to the military courthouse in the occupied territories and actually got to meet some of the families that were waiting for their children who were waiting for hearing, and go into the courtroom and even watch some of the proceedings, not with the children's proceedings. We're not allowed in with the juvenile proceedings, but watch some of the adult proceedings. So it was really interesting to be right on the scene. But we did get to talk to some of the families that were waiting for their kids, and just the intensity of what they'd been experiencing was really, they described it, as you can imagine, as really traumatic, the whole process of it. So that's our first story. Oh, go ahead, Heidi. What did you want to add? Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. I'll just quickly add that upon meeting the parents of adult children and of juveniles, the faces, the expressions, and the fear of the mothers all looked the same, and it really crosses all cultural boundaries. It's the same look of fear that any mother would have anywhere in the world. You just want to make sure that your baby is okay, even if your baby is 30. And if you don't know what's going to happen, or the outcome is going to be dire, because they will most likely be convicted, it is a scary situation for everyone. And so there's a lot of emotion and a lot of sadness. And that was the experience that we had in the areas.
Thank you so much, Heidi. So that's the first story we wanted to share. The second story is going to come from Barbara. This story comes from our Palestinian guide, Elias, and Elias is the executive director of the Holy Land Trust. This is a nonprofit based in Bethlehem that engages in nonviolent activism, specifically around healing trauma. So that I thought that was really interesting. I'm a psychologist, so that obviously was interesting to me. And he's a Christian Palestinian, and he grew up in Beit Zahur. And as a child, he witnessed his village engaging in nonviolent activism. And so Barbara's going to tell us a story about Beit Zahur that Elias shared with us. Barbara, you're on mute still. Barbara, you're still on mute. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, I'm going to talk about resistance. And at the end of World War II, the Allies who had won the war got together and decided what crimes they needed to prosecute. And they decided what would be a war crime and what would not be a war crime. And because of the French resistance and the Dutch resistance and the Polish resistance fighting the Nazis on their own soil, they decided that you could, if you were living under occupation, you could resist. You could resist your enemy. And you could resist your enemy with even guns. You could store guns, you could import guns, you could hide guns, and you could shoot the enemy. And that would not be a war crime. It would not be prosecuted. So that what they decided is that if you're living under occupation, you can resist. Well, not all resistance is armed resistance. There's also peaceful resistance. But they wrote into the UN Charter and at the Fort Geneva Convention, they wrote down that it is not a war crime to resist your occupier, even armed resistance. And I'm going to talk to you about the village of Beit Sahor. And in 1988, it was the beginning of the first Intifada, and the people of Beit Sahor wanted to resist. Up until this time, the Intifada had been going on 20 years, but the occupation had been going on 20 years, but the Palestinians had been more or less submissive. But in 1987, they became more rebellious and they started to resist. The village of Beit Sahor first started off by resisting paying their taxes. They said they would not pay their taxes to an occupier. They would only pay taxes to their own government. So they became under the Israeli radar because they had so many tax revolts. And then they thought of another thing they could do, and that would be to become self-sustaining. And they started growing their own vegetables and raising their own chickens. And then they got the idea of buying a herd of cows. Now, up until this point, they had been dependent on Israel for everything. They had to buy their vegetables from Israel. They had to buy their milk from Israel, their cheese from Israel. And they decided they would resist the occupation by becoming self-sustaining. They did not know how to take care of cows. They had been sheep farmers, but they had never been dairy farmers. And they bought 18 cows and they had a barn. They put them in the barn. And one of them even had to fly to the United States to learn how to milk these cows. They had no idea. They became efficient at this. They milked the cows. They supplied milk and cottage cheese and cream to everybody in the village. And Israel did not like this. Israel did not even like that they were raising their own chickens. And Israel put them under curfew. And they acted like this did not bother them. They knew that if they acted happy under curfew, it would just bother the Israelis because the Israelis were trying to punish them. So they went ahead and had a good time. They played cards and did things in the street, and they just had a good time. So the Israelis said, "We're going to take your cows away." The Israelis actually said to them, "The cows are a danger to the security of Israel." Well, the people of Beit Sahor thought that was funny. How could the cows be a danger? But the Israelis were serious, and they came in and they took photos of each cow with the name of the cow underneath it. There was Dolly, there was Lola, there was Mary. Each cow had a name, and the Israelis made wanted posters for each cow. And they gave the Palestinians one day to get rid of all their cows, or they would slaughter them and bulldoze the barn. So the Palestinians did something very clever. They hid the cows. So the Israelis came back the next day, ready to take the cows to slaughter them, and they couldn't find the cows. Well, they had pictures of every cow, and they went through the village searching where could the cows be. And they did this for a week. They could not find a cow. So finally, the game was up, and the villagers of Beit Sahor had taken the cows to a neighboring village and put them in the neighboring village's barn. So the Israelis found the cows and took them and slaughtered them. And that was the end of that threat. But it was not the end of the Palestinians resisting. And they are still resisting. Some of it is peaceful resistance, and some of it is armed resistance. But we need to remember that armed resistance is not a war crime. It is expected that people living under occupation will resist, and they have the right to resist.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I just love the story of the cows. And they actually made a movie about this whole thing. It's a silly, kind of funny movie called The Wanted 18, meaning the Wanted 18 Cows. it was funny to hear Elias describe this story and the story of his village that he grew up in. And then the last story we're going to tell is a story from our Israeli guide. That one was from our Palestinian guide. This one's from our Israeli guide. So let me go back to my little PowerPoint thing here. We heard about Military Court Watch, and we heard about Elias from the Holy Land Trust, and then the Wanted 18. And then this is a picture of Itamar. He was our Israeli guide. He also was part of the organization Breaking the Silence, which is a group of IDF soldiers who share openly their experiences of serving in the occupied territories with the hope of ending the occupation. And he was one of these soldiers, and he told us a story about, they were doing a training exercise, and they were doing, I'm not really a military person, but I think it was essentially doing sniper exercises. And so they were shooting into a ghost town, and he was in training. They were doing these shooting exercises, and then they were looking through the binoculars, and they were like, wait a minute, why is there an ambulance over there? And then realized that they were actually shooting live ammunition into a Palestinian village that was occupied. It wasn't empty. And he said that all of them were like, huh, that's weird. And then kind of broke for lunch and then came back and started shooting again. He said that that it's easy to become numb to what you're doing when you're being asked to do these things every day. So that was just one of many experiences that Itamar shared. And then the last thing that we just want to share a picture. We went to the Aida refugee camp. I want to move this. Hold on. Let me move this bar here so that it's not so much in our way. We went to this is our last story, and then we'll wrap up with this. We went to the Aida refugee camp. This is a Palestinian refugee camp that is in between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and has two big settlements around it. So it becomes a flashpoint for a lot of violence. And this is a picture of the canisters, the gas canisters and the shelling that happens in the camp. And what they've done is they go through and collect these canisters and turn it into these pieces of art, which I just thought was super creative. And then at one point they were even arrested for stealing Israeli military equipment, because they were taking these gas canisters that were being thrown into the camp and turning them into art. But that's a different story. That's actually not the picture I'm going to share. This is in 2015, the Israeli soldiers, there was a flash of violence. This is a picture of the Aida refugee camp, and they shot and killed this 13-year-old child, Abdel. He was killed with a single bullet to the chest by a sniper. He was standing about 75 yards away from where the conflict was happening. And the IDF did admit that it was a mistake, but nobody was held accountable for Abdel's death. But actually, this isn't even the picture that I want to share. This is the picture I want to share. As they were telling us this story about we were standing here at this sign under in this camp, and there was this man who was from the camp who was following our group and just kind of listening to what was being talked about. And quite a ways through the tour, we found out that this man was Abdel's father, this 13-year-old boy's father. And so this is the picture I want to end with today. This was a picture taken by a member of our group. This is the picture of Abdel. This is the father. And what struck me, I mean, this was a tragedy in and of itself, but what struck me is that the soldiers continue to damage this photo, and on the forehead of the picture is where they've been throwing gas canisters at the photo. There was something about that just really made me so sad, that even the memorial of this child wasn't being respected. And this man was just very quiet. He was just watching, but I went up to him afterwards and shook his hand and said that I would share the story of him and his son. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be able to keep my promise to him tonight and share that story. There were so many stories of families and parents and children and homes in the Palestinian villages, and just so many stories that were heartbreaking and hard to hear, and just really sensitized me to the need to see each other through a human lens and remember each other's humanity. And that's where we'll end it today. Also, I wanted to note, Matthew gave me the opportunity to let everyone know that we're doing a event this Saturday. It's a Swim with Gaza event, which is swimming with Gaza kids, and supporting this swim coach. This is awesome. This is his website, and he teaches kids in Gaza how to swim, and that helps them be safe. It helps them be able to swim in the sea safely. It gives them friendship and purpose and meaning, healthy recreation. And so the Swim with Gaza event is an international event where you get to swim in the pool and support teaching the kids in Gaza how to swim, taking swim lessons. And that's coming up on Saturday. So Matthew was kind enough to let me announce that. If anyone is interested in that, I'll put the information in the chat box for people.
Yeah, and put the website. We didn't actually see the website, but just put it in the chat and people can check it out with that info.
Perfect.
So we do have time for one or two questions before we go on to the next section where Laura and I are going to share about our experiences with the Israeli protest movement this summer. So let me start by one question I was going to ask to Carrie and Barbara and Heidi. What was the reaction to all this like from Senator Lee's staff? And did they, because Senator Lee doesn't have a reputation of being very sympathetic to the Palestinian side of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I'm just curious what you picked up about that.
I mean, it's very hard to sit in front of these people sharing their stories and not be impacted by it. So I think he was definitely had that person-to-person impact. I think he felt like the resolutions to these problems are different than perhaps what other folks would call for resolutions. But I do think he was deeply impacted by the individual stories. And he certainly voiced a commitment to bring those stories back to Senator Lee and have them inform their work in this arena.
That's nice. All right. Does anybody else want to ask a question to Carrie, Barbara, or Heidi before we move on? I didn't see anything in the chat.
Thank you for giving us the chance to share, and I'm excited also to hear about the more recent protests on the Israeli side. So I'm looking forward to you, Matthew.
Okay. All right, and we'll have time for some other questions a little later as well, if questions occur to folks between now and then. And yeah, I really wanted to give folks a chance to hear from Carrie and Barbara and Heidi, because there's just nothing like being there and seeing it and talking to people on all sides of the conflict to really understand what's happening, and it makes it real in a way that you just don't get otherwise. And that was certainly the case for me and Laura this summer. Laura had an academic commitment, a workshop she was participating in at the law school at Reichman University. And so I tagged along. We were there for 3 weeks. And of course, we had a lot of fun and went to the beach and restaurants and spent a lot of time with family and friends there. But we're also very cognizant of the political situation and what's going on, and the pro-democracy protest movement. And so I've got some pictures to share about that as well. So let me turn on the screen sharing and switch to that screen. And we basically saw the signs of the protest movement from the first hour that we arrived. So we got there, you land at the airport, and we jumped in a taxi, or rather on the train, into Tel Aviv, where we stayed for the 3 weeks. And, from as soon as we got out of the train station in Tel Aviv, I saw this sign over one of the highway overpasses by the train station. It says, "Ein ge'ava bli demokratia." There's no pride without democracy. And you can see the rainbow flag there. And Pride Month is a very big thing in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv has a big LGBT community and a huge pride parade every June that we had missed. We didn't get there till later in the month, but we attended it when we were there in 2019. I saw it on this sticker on a bike in a bike shop where I was trying to rent a bike. This little sticker somebody put on their bike says Demokratia, which is the chant at the weekly protests. We went to the weekly protests every Saturday night while we were there. This past Saturday night was the 33rd consecutive week that there have been hundreds of thousands of Israelis protesting all over the country. We were there for weeks 25, 26, and 27. It's really an extraordinary thing. I mean, if you put it in terms of America, to have that many people, I mean, literally millions of Israelis have participated in this protest movement, which, you know, put it in American terms, it would be tens of millions, which is, you know, the biggest probably America has ever seen, maybe bigger than anything America's ever seen. And the very first thing you see when you come from the Tel Aviv side and you're walking toward Kaplan Street and the protest site is you get to the section for the anti-occupation activists. Because the protest movement is a coalition of all these different people who are fighting to defend the basic principles of liberal democracy, such as judicial independence and separation of powers, which are under threat because of the proposals from the current government. And so this one section that you get to first is the anti-occupation section. So this sign says, Ein bitachon im kibush. There's no security as long as there's an occupation going on. And this sign says, this is similar to what Barbara was saying a few minutes ago, there's no occupation without resistance, without opposition to it. This is somebody in the anti-occupation section who was holding up a sign of a 2-year-old boy who on the 5th of June, Mohammed Tamimi, who was 2.5 years old, was shot and killed by Israeli soldiers. And it says, end the killing, end the mourning, end the occupation. This is somebody who had a little poster that he had on his little wheelie there, where it's pointing out that the occupation is the elephant in the room that often nobody wants to talk about. So one thing you can see here in this little clip is that in the anti-occupation section, you do see people waving not just Israeli flags, which are the theme of the whole protest movement, but also Palestinian flags, sending the message in support of a two-state solution. This is a group that we're very familiar with here in Utah because Carrie used to be the chair of the board of the American Friends of Combatants for Peace. Combatants for Peace brings together Israeli former soldiers and Palestinian former combatants, militants, terrorists, as they're often termed on the Israeli side, to have dialogue and reconciliation. And so they have a table set up there. This is a table selling T-shirts against the occupation. Then as you move closer to the main protest site, you get to different groups. This is a group of educators saying that the secular education system is under attack because oftentimes this whole protest movement has been called the long-delayed protest of the secular Israelis who are increasingly becoming a minority. I actually happened to come across this chart shortly thereafter that shows how the trend is that more and more Israelis are either in the Arab Israeli school system, where 25% of the kids are learning, or in the Haredi or national religious education systems that here in 2015 were making up a third of all the kids in Israel. So that the one that was being defended by that little group that used to be 51% of the secular Israeli school system is now down to 42%, giving you a sense of the demographic trend in Israel. This is a good government group called the Movement for Quality Government, and their table. That's a group of students against corruption. This is a group of veterans sounding the theme. The words there say Chofshi Ba'artzenu, which is probably the most powerful theme of the protest movement. Free in our land, words taken from Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem. Israeli flags everywhere. And so this was the headline in Haaretz, and the view from above that first week. They always have a big poster that they take a picture of from above. We happen to be underneath it. And it's called Kaplan Force because it's on Kaplan Street. So that's become a theme of the protest. And we happen to be underneath it. And this was the view from underneath it and from just above the edge of it. That was the main speaker. The first week we went, former prime minister and defense minister and chief of the Israeli military, Ehud Barak, talking about how this shouldn't be the last generation that has the rule of law in Israel. This is a sign I thought was interesting, the government of Israel against the state of Israel. This is brothers and sisters in arms, IDF reservists and veterans in defense of Israeli democracy, one of the most important groups in the protest movement. This is somebody from a centrist group called Darkenu holding up a sign of Menachem Begin, the first Likud prime minister, who was himself a big supporter of liberal democracy and would not have been happy about what's happening now. Here's somebody holding up a puppet of Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, and his sign says, fighting for his vision, because his vision was of Israel as a liberal democracy. This is a poster that says, Demokratia or merit, democracy or revolt. This is a sign that says, Amanim Megillat Ha'atzmaut, loyal to the Israeli Declaration of Independence, which is the founding document of Israel, like in the United States, and which has very strong language in support of equality and equal rights for all, regardless of religion, gender, etc. Let's see. These are a couple of stickers I saw at my cousin's house. The one on the right says, we were silent about the occupation, and so we got a dictatorship. And the one on the left says, there can't be any democracy with an occupation. There also are polls being done in Israel constantly that show, as this one does, that if the elections were held today, the right-wing and ultra-Orthodox and Likud-led government would shrink from 64 to 56. They wouldn't have a majority anymore if the election were held today, and the opposition supporting liberal democracy would take over. This is somebody who had a sign that I thought was kind of cute. It says, "Efshar gam kaitz v'gam diktatora." I can't deal with summer and dictatorship at the same time. It gets very hot in Israel in summer. The second week we went, the main speaker was the mayor of Tel Aviv, Ron Huldai, who, and this talks a little bit about what he said in support of democracy and judicial independence and against the settler rampages. So that was a little clip of him speaking. Here you see somebody holding up a sign with a broken heart how many people feel about what's happening. This was an interesting thing that took place the second week we were there. Actually, a fist fight broke out between the left and right wings of the protest movement, between the anti-occupation activists, who are the left wing of the movement, and the veterans groups, the brothers in arms, as they call themselves, who are kind of the right wing of the protest movement. And, you know, there are tensions within the movement, but the trend over time that I think we've seen is that there's more and more awareness, even among the veterans who initially didn't want to talk about the occupation, who are understanding more and more as time goes on. It's now been 8 months, 33 consecutive weeks of protest, that if you don't deal with the occupation, you're not going to be able to defend Israeli democracy, because the main two forces behind the whole movement to get rid of the Supreme Court's ability to be independent and have an independent judiciary, the two forces are the ultra-Orthodox, who don't want to serve in the military, and the settlers, who don't want any limits on their ability to take away Palestinian lands and rampage in Palestinian villages and so forth. This was the big poster as seen from above the second week. It says resist. And this is a t-shirt that says, if you don't rise up to be a citizen, they'll make you a subject. This is somebody from the Physiotherapists Union saying, democracy, we've got your back, or something like that. This is a sign that says, hands off the judiciary. This is a sign in English to President Biden saying, don't trust this liar, son of a liar, and his own translation of that, referring to Bibi Netanyahu. And here we ran into Orit and Elad. Some of us here in Utah know them because they are Israelis who were here in our community a decade ago. She was the director of the religious school at Kol Ami, and we just happened to run into them by chance. Hadn't seen them in 10 years since they returned to Israel, and they were there at the protests. This one says, seculars, not slaves, in line with that theme. And then here we've got the psychologists organization set up a bunch of tables in support, offering psychological first aid to anyone who might need it. This is a cute t-shirt taking off on, you know, the American notorious RBG, referring to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the Israelis have picked up on that. And this is GBM, Galia Baharav Miari, who's the Israeli Attorney General appointed by the last government that Bibi has been threatening to fire, who's been standing up for democracy. This is a poster you see in the Israeli bus stations in Tel Aviv. It says, settler pogroms backed by the government. And this is, you see here, Bibi surrounded by the most right-wing members of his government, including Smotrich and Ben Gvir. Here's another poll that was on TV that it also showed on the right side that the government would shrink from 64 to 56, would no longer have a majority if elections were held today. Unfortunately, the elections aren't supposed to be for another 3 years. At this point, I wanted to ask if Laura wanted to jump in, because this was sort of a spontaneous demonstration that took place that I didn't attend, but Laura did. It was in the middle of the week that Laura attended. Laura, are you able to jump in and show us a few pictures?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. It's just 2 pictures, but I did put them in a PowerPoint. Can you all see my PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Great. So am I in slideshow mode? I want to say here. Okay. So so when we arrived in Israel, there was like the anniversary of the protests, which had been occurring for about 6 months. And just to back up, the protests are largely in response to an attempt to overhaul the judiciary in Israel to remove judicial review, which basically means to turn Israel into somewhat of a dictatorship without separation of powers. And so when we were there, it had been going on for about 6 months, and the protests were really peaceful. And when you would go to the protests, or when we did the first 2 Saturdays, it was almost like, I don't want to say a party, but very like organized, very peaceful. There were music and speeches. But what happened was, and it was on July 5th, the Tel Aviv police chief was forced to resign. His name is Ami Eshed. And he was really forced out because he refused to use unreasonable force against the protesters, right? No one had been injured in all that time, neither, well, especially no police, no military. So basically he was forced to quit. He made a speech. He said he quit on political grounds. And he said that he abdicated restraint, and he couldn't, he was basically pushed out. So what happened was, it's all on WhatsApp. So I got a message that everybody was going to go into the street. So this was not a regular Saturday night planned evening of protest. So I basically rode my bike at 1 a.m. to the highway. So with the protesters just poured into the streets and shut down the ILO, which they're doing regularly now. And I guess I would just say, I think this is a shifting point in the protest from the protesters, and the movement started to feel like they needed to become, started to have a discussion about whether they should be more violent, to use violence, or more radical forms of protest, perhaps less peaceful forms. So this is a picture, just real quick, of the highway. I was really honestly too afraid to go down, but what you see here, if you can see it, is this is a line of police, of the I don't know if that's police. And this is a water cannon, and what they're doing is they're trying to contain the crowd here. I don't know if you can see my pointer, as well as to contain the crowd and to really get them off the highway, to open up the highway. So this is like 1 a.m. And then this is a picture of this. I'll show you just a brief video and then I'll stop. But this, you can see what's happening here with the protests is that they're starting bonfires on the highway, and the police are using water cannons. And this is the day, literally the day, in response to the protests that are occurring after Eshed was forced out. So the protesters are changing their tactics to some extent, and the police are deciding that they're going to show, right, that that now that Eshed's gone, that they are going to use force. And the water cannons, by the way, don't look too bad there, but people do lose eyes and have permanent injuries from those water cannons. So I just wanted to share that because Matthew didn't attend that. And the mood really changed, I felt like, that night, from to more violent and tense atmosphere, in a shift in the movement. So that's what I wanted to share.
Thanks, Laura. And I'll just add to that I mean, the protest movement leaders were always emphasizing that they're nonviolent, but that they were planning in the month of July in particular to be more confrontational. But they said in a nonviolent way. And so they considered this to be nonviolent resistance, but confrontational. And especially in the month of July, because that's when the vote was going to be taken on the first element of the judicial overhaul. So anyway, here's a picture of us the final Saturday night that we were there with one of Laura's colleagues on the far right, who had, I guess she was the one who told you about, come join us on that Wednesday night. On the final Saturday night, the big poster there that you can see from the air here says, "V'ha'ikar lo lefached klal, chofshi ba'artzenu." And the principle is not to be at all afraid, which is a quote from a prayer that many of us are familiar with. And then at the bottom it says, "Free in our land," from the Israeli national anthem. And the main speaker that night was Professor Yuval Noah Harari, who's very well known all over the world, who said, it's not, you're not a traitor, you're a patriot if you refuse to follow the orders of a government and an army of a dictatorship. And that's one of the biggest themes. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention about that last Saturday night is where we were standing, we saw this sign, which is the biggest sign I saw that wasn't the one aimed at the air. It says, "The United States is boycotting Bibi while Iran is racing toward a nuclear bomb. The judicial overhaul is an existential threat to Israel." So the point is that Bibi is choosing his super right-wing partners and their agenda over the alliance with the United States, and that it's a direct threat to Israel's security if we allow it to continue. And this is a cute sticker that somebody put on the sidewalk, that Netanyahu is leading to a civil war. And the protest movement is well funded because it's backed by the tech sector, which is huge in Israel. 10% of the Israeli economy is the tech sector. And their theme was July of Resistance. And so you saw these all over Israel. That's another poll. Let me switch over now to, the day we left, actually, it was interesting. Our flight was at 4 p.m., which is exactly when the protest movement was calling for people to protest at the airport. So we went extra early. Over 10,000 protested at the airport, 66 arrested all over the country. But we didn't end up seeing that. We just saw this view of as we departed Tel Aviv. But the one of the most powerful elements of the protest movement is now thousands of reservists, including over 1,000 in the Air Force, have said that they will not continue to participate in the military if this continues, for a number of reasons that we can go into. And we had the Jewish holiday of the 9th of Av last month that brings to mind, because that's when we mark the history of the destruction of the temples and the fall of Jewish sovereignty in the year 70 of the Common Era, which, according to Jewish tradition, was because of Jewish extremism and because of internal divisions. And so it raised the question again of whether religious extremism would bring down Jewish sovereignty again in the current era. And here we have a headline about Israeli security officials or former security officials talking about how the judicial coup is a fatal blow to Israeli security if it isn't stopped and reversed, as well as could be a fatal blow to Israel's economy. And this was when we got home to the U.S. This was front page news in the Washington Post when the Netanyahu government took the first vote to limit the ability of the courts to overturn certain governmental decisions. So the other thing that I was going to share, if folks can stick with us another 10 minutes or so, let's see. The other thing that I participated in, we participated in two other events that I thought people might be interested in. One was a tour by Ir Amim in Jerusalem of a section of East Jerusalem where the right-wing settlers are trying to push out the Arab population and take over with Jewish settlers called Sheikh Jarrah. And so we went on a tour there that I won't go into all the details of, but it's basically, this is a picture of one property where they've kicked out the Arabs who were living there, the Palestinians, and you can see there's a right-wing Jewish family there flying the Israeli flag, while all the homes to the left and right are still occupied by Palestinians. And we met with some of the Palestinians who have been threatened by this. And I really recommend the tours that Ir Amim does if you're able to participate in one of those. And then the other event that I participated in was in the West Bank itself, where you can see here all the logos at the bottom, Peace Now and Combatants for Peace and a bunch of other groups did a joint Israeli-Palestinian march against the settlements. And so there were 400 of us on 8 buses that rode into the West Bank together. And it's interesting, once you get over the Green Line and you get into the West Bank, you start to see all these real estate ads saying, come live at our settlement in the West Bank and you'll pay, you know, a quarter of the price of what you pay in Tel Aviv for a much bigger apartment. And, you know, this sign says, welcome to Avnei Chayfetz. It's so wonderful that you've returned home. And we went into this area in the northern West Bank between Nablus and Jenin, where these settlements are. Pdumim is the settlement where Smotrich lives, one of the most right-wing people in the Knesset, a follower of Meir Kahane. This is another settlement at the top of a hill. You can see here the poster from the Chabad movement, which is very big in the settlement movement. And the army stopped our buses and wouldn't let us go to where we were supposed to meet the Palestinian villagers and march together as an Israeli-Palestinian peaceful protest to one of the settlement sites called Homesh. So we all got out of the buses and just started walking through the olive groves. This is the group from Combatants for Peace. But what happened was, even though Peace Now, which was leading this whole thing, had tried to coordinate with the army and told them we were coming and everything, the army declared the march illegal and started setting off fire bombs to start fires to block us from getting there. So you can see here that we're walking along the highway and they've set all this underbrush on fire. And eventually they corralled us all, hundreds of people, on a hillside, and we couldn't get any closer to where we were trying to get to join up with the Palestinians. So the marches, the Peace Now leaders worked out a deal with the army where we would go to a picnic site and meet with the Palestinians there, and they would let our buses then come and get us and take us back to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and everywhere else that we'd come from. And this was the headlines in the Israeli media that afternoon and evening. And this was in another newspaper, the Times of Israel. So it did make headlines. It got the attention, you know, that we wanted on these settlements, and on the fact that they are, you know, illegal and so forth. And then the last thing I was going to show, let's see. Okay. Hang on just a sec. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about what J Street has been up to recently, because obviously, you know, all this stuff going on in Israel has tremendous implications for the U.S. Relationship with Israel. So one of the biggest things that J Street has been focused on recently is supporting the Israeli democracy movement. And can we get Congress and as many members of Congress as possible to support the Israeli democracy movement? So this was the headline today in Haaretz, that we've now gotten 43 members of the House of Representatives to support a resolution in support of the Israeli democracy movement. So you can find that on their website today. And the supporters of that are not just J Street conservative movement, the more progressive groups, the National Council of Jewish Women, the Jewish Council on Public Affairs. So that's one of the big initiatives that J Street is pursuing right now. If you go to the J Street website at jstreet.org, you can sign the petition. And if you happen to be in a target district, they'll send you an email saying, please call your representative. All right, I'll come back to that in a minute. The other big thing that's been going on recently is that AIPAC, which is supposed to be the main pro-Israel lobbying organization, this year has declared war on J Street. They sent out a mailing in the last few weeks where they're saying that J Street is the biggest threat to Israel, not Iraq's nuclear weapons or Hamas that still says it wants to destroy Israel. Did I say Iraq? I meant Iran's nuclear weapons. AIPAC is saying that J Street is the big threat. And this has inspired, of course, a big pushback. J Street has actually been spending hundreds of thousands of dollars pushing their theme that J Street is many things, but it's not pro-Israel, which is, of course, nonsense. J Street published an op-ed in the foreword showing about how out of touch AIPAC is. This was in the foreword this week, where a rabbi says that this attack from AIPAC on J Street has convinced him to join J Street. The Israeli protest movement published this op-ed in the Israeli media in Hebrew and English because AIPAC just recently organized a trip of a couple of dozen members of Congress to Israel, but they refused to meet with the protest movement. And so in this op-ed, they talk about how disappointed they are that AIPAC is supporting Netanyahu, and they talk about how grateful they are that so many other organizations like J Street have been bringing the voice of the democracy movement into the halls of Congress and to the U.S. government, as well as to the U.S. Jewish community. The editorial board of Haaretz published this editorial a week or two ago. In the Jerusalem Post recently, a former AIPAC senior official, Doug Bloomfield, blasted AIPAC for what they're doing. And then here, this was in Haaretz today, that former Prime Minister Ehud Barak has been very critical of AIPAC as well, and has been, one of the leaders of the protest movement, calling for American Jewish support for the protest movement. This was an op-ed in The Hill by some of the leaders of the protest last month, American political support and American Jewish community support for the protest movement, for the Israeli democracy movement, since it's such a critical time in Israel's history, and calling for the American Jewish community and our congressional representatives to support democracy in Israel. And President Biden has actually been pretty vocal about this. And so we need to get Congress on board with that as well. So one important way I mentioned a minute ago, go to the jstreet.org website and sign the petition in support of the protest movement. The other thing that J Street has coming up is the convention next spring in Washington, in person, where there's probably going to be about 5,000 people, which is how many people J Street generally gets at its conferences in DC every year. So I want to encourage people to begin planning now. Obviously, it's a long way off, but you can start planning now to attend that. So let me stop there and open it up to any questions, comments, thoughts that people might want to share. I don't know if we have anybody with us who was on the recent trip to Israel with Ir Amim. I know Wilma, you made a trip to Israel recently. I think Rob, you did too. So I don't know if you guys wanted to share anything from your travels there. But yeah, let me just open it up to folks' comments and other thoughts. If anyone is trying to speak, you are muted.
Well, this is not too relevant to your main point, but you showed one of the Lubavitcher posters. If I saw one, I saw 1,000 of them while I was there. Not sure what to make.
Well, they're big, and they're very big politically with one of the ultra-Orthodox political parties that's in the current government. And they're on both of the agendas that want to get rid of judicial independence. They are both looking for draft exemptions for their ultra-Orthodox members, and they're big supporters of the settlement movement. So, very unfortunate. Rochelle, were you going to say something?
Well, I just wondered what is next in Israel. I know the Supreme Court is planning on ruling, which is
right.
So bizarre in itself. But
scheduled the hearing.
What happened? Yeah. So just what's next?
Yeah, so two big things happening with the Supreme Court in the fall. One is that the Supreme Court is going to hear the appeals. A number of groups in the protest movement have filed appeals with the Supreme Court to overturn what was passed in July. What was passed in July was eliminating the ability of the Supreme Court to overturn government decisions on the basis of what's termed extreme unreasonableness.
Right.
Which is a common doctrine in parliamentary democracies that the courts have that power. So the question is whether the Supreme Court will overturn that on the basis of that it is a direct, undermining of Israel's basic liberal democracy and separation of powers. And the Supreme Court has in the past reserved to itself the right to overturn that kind of thing. If it does, then the question is, and if the government, because Bibi has refused to say whether he would obey a decision of the Supreme Court that does that, and you could have a real constitutional crisis. What would the army do at that point? And there was a discussion about that on Utah Public Radio, where Professor Amos Giora from the University of Utah Law School, who's also Israeli and a retired lieutenant colonel in the IDF, and was a legal advisor to the IDF. And he was raising the question, and he was saying, when he was interviewed about this yesterday, that he thought the army would side with the Supreme Court. But who knows? You could have a real constitutional crisis. So that's the first big thing coming up with the court in September. In October, two of the senior judges are hitting their term limits.
Right.
Israel has term limits for judges at the age of 70. They have to retire. And so that brings up the question of who would replace them. And one of the things the Netanyahu government has wanted to do is reshape the Judicial Appointments Committee and remake the judicial appointments process so it's not controlled as it is now by a combination of politicians and the legal establishment, but where the politicians would take it over completely. Because the legal establishment has tended to support liberal democracy and separation of powers and the powers of the Supreme Court to overturn government decisions. So that's going to be a big fight as well, because the two who are being forced to retire are two who are considered on the liberal side, including the current Chief Justice, Esther Chayut. So those are the two biggest things coming up in the fall. The question of will they pick up with the additional elements of the judicial overhaul, or will this be as far as they can go politically? After they passed the law in July to eliminate judicial review on the basis of extreme unreasonableness, several members of Likud, several Likud members of the Knesset who are part of the governing coalition said, we're not going any further. This is as far as we're going to go. This was hard enough, controversial enough, divisive enough. We're not going to go any further. But who knows how that'll end up playing out politically. So that's what we have to look forward to in the fall when the Knesset comes back into session. Other questions, comments? Meir, were you
Yeah, I
going to say
have a
something?
question. What was your sense, both Laura and Matthew, about not American political, government, but American Jewish responses need to, because there was a moment, it wasn't that long ago, when liberal Israelis were saying, it's enough already. We've benefited certainly from American involvement, but you're your country and we're our country, and it's time for us to make our own decisions. And there were lots and lots of American Jews who said, we love Israel, but it's not ours to tell them how to run their government. And I'm wondering whether this situation has changed the conversation at all.
I think my feeling is that it has, and that that's why AIPAC is acting so desperate, and unfortunately has moved even more to the right. They've hired one of Trump's people to run their digital media and run this campaign against J Street, unfortunately. And AIPAC in the last election endorsed 100 of the Republican election deniers who voted against certifying the 2020 election in the House of Representatives. So I think there's more and more of an understanding. And you see that in the fact that Rick Jacobs, the rabbi who's the head of the Reform movement, spoke at Kaplan Street at one of the Saturday night protests a few months ago.
As did Sharon Brose. Lots of rabbis from the United States.
Okay. And the head of NCJW spoke at one of the protests, one of the Saturday night protests, National Council of Jewish Women. And tell us, Sharon Gross is affiliated with which movement?
Sharon Gross, she's wonderfully, she was from JTS, but she's the head of ICAR, which is a enormous synagogue community now in Los Angeles. I think it's got over 2,000 members, and has been very, very vocal about the need for American involvement. And it is uncomfortable for the community to hear it. They're very, very liberal, but this is a new kind of intervention. Their politics have been pretty located, focused on American politics very effectively. And now she's saying we need to get busy here.
Yeah.
And it's causing discomfort in the liberal Jewish American communities.
Well, along those lines, can you talk about Thomas Friedman's and his recent op-ed about rethinking American aid to Israel?
Right.
Certainly.
Yeah. No, and even beyond that, I mean, he has turned into the voice of Biden, where he went and met with President Biden and then wrote one of his columns about how disturbed Biden is by the direction things are going in Israel. And, the question is, what's that going to translate into policy-wise? Now, Amos Giora has been very out front on this from the University of Utah, who we mentioned, one of Laura's colleagues, where he's written 2 op-eds now in The Hill, which is that Capitol Hill newspaper in DC. And he also said it on the radio yesterday. He said that Biden should cut off the military aid to Israel if Bibi is going to continue with this. And that's the only language that the Netanyahu government's going to understand. 2 former U.S. ambassadors to Israel, both Jewish, have published recently saying that the U.S. shouldn't be providing aid to Israel anymore. That Israel, and one of the Republican candidates in the debate this was a point in the Republican to be giving Israel $3 billion a year in aid. Now, J Street's official position has long been that J Street supports the $3.8 billion of annual aid. But even in J Street now, I'm hearing people say, well, that MOU expires soon in another few years, and it's going to be a whole new conversation given the direction things are going in Israel after that. So, it's
I was just going to say that the U.S. Congress would be the determinant there, and I find it. I'm cynical that they would remove military funding for Israel.
Yeah, well, time will tell. That conversation will happen in the coming years. But certainly, I would encourage people to not just support J Street, but also support J Street PAC, which has, I'm not sure what the latest numbers are, but has been at the $5 to $10 million level every election cycle. I participated in a meeting recently with the woman who's the leading candidate to be the new U.S. Senator from the state of Maryland, now that Ben Cardin isn't running for re-election next year. And for J Street to have the ammunition to support candidates in opposition to the candidates that AIPAC has been supporting, is going to be very able to compete directly with AIPAC in Democratic primaries, in Democratic versus Republican races where that's possible. So I would encourage everyone to support not just J Street, but also J Street PAC. And I know, Rochelle, of course, you've been our local leader on that. All right, well, I don't want to keep folks. We've already gone certainly over our hour. Really appreciate everyone's patience and sticking with us. So I'll just wrap up by saying that, you know, this is a tremendously important time in what's happening in Israel with the Jewish people as a whole and what the future of the Jewish people are going to be. So thank you for sharing about that. Thanks everyone for wanting to be informed and involved. Thank you to Carrie and Heidi and Barbara for sharing with us about what you saw in Palestine and the West Bank. And stay tuned. Continue to stay involved, continue to follow things, and you'll be hearing from us. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you, Laura.
He's very good.
Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, you bet.